Okay, so it's 10 a.m. and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Maria Moreno. I'm the head of operations of USA for IOM. And before starting with the official program, I would like to draw your attention to some housekeeping rules, and I will share my screen in a minute. So you can see our social media handles. I had it open. One second. So if you want to share with us or share any of the remarks being done at this event, please make sure to tag us in our different social media handles and use the event hashtags Juntos por los Venezolanos and Together for Venezuelans. This event is being recorded and we will share the link of the recording after the meeting. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session, and we would like to ask you to submit your questions and comments through the chat box on your right-hand side on the screen with the little icon of message. So with no further ado, I will now give the floor to Luca Dalloglio. He is the IOM Washington Chief of Mission and USA for IOM Chief Executive Officer. Luca, you have the floor.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Maria. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to welcome you all for this event, which is quite important and on which I would welcome you on behalf of USA for IOM and OIOM, the International Organization for Migration, the UN agency dedicated to migration, displacement, and all aspects of human mobility. Special thanks to Citi Foundation and the Embassy of Colombia for partnering with us today for the second event in this series focusing on COVID-19, human mobility, and the private sector. Today, we shall be discussing the regional response to migration from Venezuela and the role of the private sector in the context of COVID-19. Only last Tuesday, May 26th, an international donors conference in solidarity with Venezuelans, refugees, and migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean was convened by the government of Spain, the European Union, and with the support of Canada, Norway, and the co-sponsorship of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration, IOM. The conference aimed to mobilize support for one of the largest external displacement crises in the world, second only to the Syria crisis, and the largest in Latin America and the Caribbean in modern history. To date, more than 5 million refugees and migrants from Venezuela have sought safety and protection across the world. The vast majority, approximately 80%, are in Latin America and in the Caribbean, with Colombia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Brazil hosting the most. The figures are just staggering. Let's reflect a second. 5.1 million Venezuelans dispersed over the world, of which 4.3 in Latin America and the Caribbean, 1.8 in Colombia, 861,000 in Peru, 455,000 in Chile, 363,000 in Ecuador, 252,000 in Brazil. These are ever-changing statistics, but they convey the magnitude of this phenomenon and its human implications. The impact of COVID-19 has weakened the economies of the host country across the region and has pushed many Venezuelans in deeper poverty, exposing the most vulnerable to exploitation, gender-based violence, and human trafficking. Limited access to services, particularly health systems and education, have also been put to the test. The UN Regional Interagency Coordination Platform targets 3.1 million migrants and refugees to complement national responses with shelter, water, sanitation, and other priority sectors. The 26th May Donor Conference was a success, diplomatically and financially. It attracted several donor countries from the European member states, Arab states, East Asian countries, and of course, North America. International financial institutions took a big role with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the European Investment Bank making important announcements and pledges. Civil society organizations also participated actively with the Red Cross movement and faith-based organizations advocating for access and resources. The private sector has been only in part engaged in this process, which has initially, and rightly so, focused on emergency humanitarian response. And yet, as these movements tend to become more permanent, certainly more long-lasting, and return options are elusive and less likely to occur in the immediate terms, issues of socioeconomic integration and sustainability become central part of the response. I have a few background noises. I don't know if maybe keeping mics on mute. Anyway, the role of the private sector is fundamental to address socioeconomic integration, and it's in part a missing actor in the response. We have seen several examples of private sector-led initiatives in several countries, from oil technicians being employed in the southern countries to health personnel becoming very active part in the COVID-19 response. And still, while these examples are important, the largest majority of migrants and refugees are facing increasing hardship because of the coronavirus impact. A dialogue among relief practitioners, development actors, and private sector becomes more urgent than ever. Please allow me to introduce our speakers and panelists for this morning event. First, our keynote speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Eduardo Stein, Joint Special Representative of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the IOM for Venezuela Refugees and Migrants. We are also joined by His Excellency Ambassador Francisco Santos from the Embassy of Colombia as our co-host. Sarah Stamler, IOM Regional Integration Officer from the IOM Venezuela Regional Response Team, has joined us from Panama as the moderator of the conversation and question and answer facilitator, following the remarks from Mr. Stein and Ambassador Santos. We're also joined by our private sector representatives panel, Melissa Pino, Vice President, Citi Latam, and Head of Corporate Citizenship and Government Affairs, Bruce McMaster, President, Asociación Nacional de Industriales, Andi, Colombia. We would like to thank you all for joining us and our guests. And once again, we would like to thank the Citi Foundation and the Embassy of Colombia both for their partnerships and for their participation today. May you all benefit from the engaging remarks and following discussion. Without further ado, allow me to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Eduardo Stein, to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca, and good morning. Thank you for inviting me to share information on the work of the Response for Venezuelans platform that was created to assist Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as to support the host country's efforts to face the new and multi-dimensional challenges posed by COVID-19. I would like to welcome the audience and congratulate the organizers for such a timely event. You know the numbers. Luca Dall'Olio reminded us of them. And in this overview, I would like to underscore that over the past years, Latin American countries have made commendable efforts to respond to a situation of unprecedented human displacement in the region for which no one was prepared. The response of host countries was exemplary as they mobilized their already stretched resources on top of their own struggles to welcome Venezuelan migrants and refugees and tried to keep their doors open for them. These efforts, even amid COVID-19 crisis, are an example of long-standing spirit of solidarity of the region. Of course, the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic complicated things to devastating levels and poses additional challenges of unforeseeable magnitude, putting the health and social welfare systems to the test, as well as the country's ability to maintain an inclusive society. While the COVID-19 pandemic is yet to reach its peak in the Latin American region, overstretched public health services are expected to be even more challenged over the coming months. As of March 2020, countries in Latin America adopted measures to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, including entry restrictions at several land borders. Host governments are receiving increasing numbers of requests from refugees and migrants from Venezuela for support to return to their home country. This demonstrates the precariousness of the situation that an ever-growing number of refugees and migrants is facing in host countries and is a cause of great concern among the R4V partners, given the health and protection risks associated with returns under the current circumstances. Due to a range of movement restrictions and quarantine measures adopted by governments to curb the spread of the pandemic, the ability of refugees and migrants to regularly enter and stay in some countries has decreased, resulting in risks of increased irregular border crossings and also heightened demands in areas of concentration and available services there. Refugees and migrants, especially those in irregular situations, are children. They are at high risk of being left out of the health and social welfare programs and continue to be particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, including violence and discrimination, smuggling and trafficking, family separation, including unaccompanied and separated children, which remains a significant challenge with diminished capacities to implement coordination and tracking mechanisms. With schools and universities closed across the region, education of children and youth is of rising concern, as many refugees and migrants have limited capacities to access online schooling and other forms of education available for nationals. Refugees and migrants from Venezuela have become even more vulnerable, as many are at risk of losing their already limited and social economic support to cover basic needs such as shelter, food, or healthcare. Availability of hygiene items and personal protective equipment is a challenge for people on the move and in densely populated areas and or in shelters, as well as response actors. Many are facing the additional stigma by host communities of being unwanted foreigners, including negative perceptions associated with a fear of the spread of the virus. The Response for Venezuelan platform role in the COVID-19 response has the objective of complementing government responses in the region through the Refugee and Migrant Response Plan. The R4B platform continues effectively collaborating with other coordinating mechanisms in place as foreseen in the Global Humanitarian Response Plan. The R4B platform advocates for full inclusion of refugees and migrants in the national COVID-19 responses of the 17 countries covered by the R4B response. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, R4B partners have been implementing a number of prevention and response activities, such as dissemination of information on hygiene and available services, as well as anti-xenophobia and protection messages through existing trustworthy communication channels. Also, assistance at support spaces. Few are partially open, some are operating through helplines. Others have been adapted as areas of isolation for COVID-19 patients multiply, and some are operating remotely. Also, physical distancing policies and additional hygiene measures in community kitchens have been implemented, and prioritization of assistance with vouchers and delivery of food baskets and special measures of cash-based intervention have also been displayed. The Regional Interagency Coordination Platform, the R4V, in close coordination with national and local authorities and with WHO leading the health sector's response, has activated a critical revision of operations in the region to prioritize essential protection and life-saving actions in the context of the pandemic. The review takes into account particular COVID-19 related needs and priorities of host governments and focuses on responding to refugees and migrants' particular needs in the areas such as health, protection, shelter, nutrition, food, and livelihoods and integration. The Refugee and Migration Response Plan, RMRP, constitutes a planning, coordination, and fundraising tool, and it is the largest response plan ever put in place in the region. It is a result of a wide field-driven consultation process involving host governments, civil society, and faith-based organizations, local communities and donors, as well as the refugees and migrants themselves. So the need for funding has become an urgent imperative. As of May 2020, 12% of the now 1.41 billion required for the 2020 Refugee and Migrant Response Plan have been met. As Luca illustrated us in the introduction, the European Union, together with the government of Spain and Canada and Norway as co-conveners, and with the support of UNHCR and IOM, have convened the International Donor Conference in solidarity with Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the countries of the region amid COVID-19, held virtually on May 26. Generous pledges were announced, but the magnitude of the ongoing crisis and the unmet and increased needs and vulnerabilities require further support to host countries to address humanitarian and development gaps. So I would like to zero in for a couple of minutes in the role of the private sector. The private sector is being recognized increasingly as an essential partner in humanitarian responses and as a central actor in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. They particularly introduce new technologies and other innovations and share technical expertise and networks in a very delicate balance between containing the pandemic and finding solutions to avert the implications in public health demands, but as well in the formidable efforts required for the economic recovery of the region. We must also not forget that businesses are part of the communities that we serve and are also affected by vulnerable crises. Their infrastructure, their supply chains, the workforce, and markets can all be affected and are being affected. But businesses can contribute in various ways, such as making direct contribution, financial or in kind, providing pro bono services, supporting appeals, engaging in advocacy and awareness of crisis, and promoting philanthropy among staff, clients, and networks. The Response for Venezuelan platform actively works towards strengthening its partnership with the private sector and strongly encourages and welcomes private sector engagement across all its sectors. We have indeed engaged all of these efforts from the private sectors in traditional ways, but private sector has a special eye on innovating resources and innovation itself. For example, one of the RMRP 2020 priorities includes developing alliances with private sector to identify employment opportunities for refugees and migrants. To date, $2 million have been contributed to the RMRP response from various private sector organizations. But what are the entrepreneurial abilities, dexterities, and diversified know-how that the private sector can contribute better than anybody? For example, training trainees that could work with Venezuelans and their receiving communities in managing small productive activities, managing their funds, their earnings, their savings, how to reinvest intelligently and creatively. Those efforts could make a formidable difference in the socioeconomic integration of the newcomers and the communities that receive them. Why reproduce the obvious? Entrepreneurial innovation from the private sector can bring new ideas and productive practices to the terrain. Those novelties are the ones that we would like to keep exploring jointly. Yesterday, I read a very funny but tragic comment about having Venezuela import gasoline and make a big fuss about it, which the writer said it's like Colombia importing coffee and make a big celebration. We do not want to replicate the obvious. We want the private sector innovative capacities to work creatively and productively with us. I would like to close my intervention emphasizing the sense of urgency of these humanitarian and development needs and highlighting the life-saving impact that a comprehensive funding of the RMRP funding has, not only on the migrants and refugees of Venezuela, but also on the millions of persons in host communities. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stain. Now Ambassador Santos has the floor. You have to turn on your camera and your mic.
It's turned on. Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me please thank IOM, Citi, and the panelists for having this opportunity to speak about a tragedy that is almost impossible to solve. And I don't want to be I want to frame this in terms of how good we are doing, etc., because we're all doing the best we can. I just want to paint at how big the problems are, how worse they're going to get, how the COVID-19 crisis has really fell upon a tragedy. So it's a tragedy on top of the tragedy, and what can we do, and what can happen, which I think it's what this is all about. Let me just start by painting a small panorama of Colombia. 2 million refugees, wide open borders until May, when we closed it because of the coronavirus crisis, which has slowed down almost 90% the income of people, of migrants. 60,000 migrants have gone back, almost 3% of the 2 million, 3-4% of the 2 million Venezuelans that are here. More than 100,000 attend services to pregnant women, pregnant migrants, free of charge. All of the kids are in school. 135,000 kids have access to the food, the school food program. More than 200,000 are enrolled in schools. Colombia received this, and I think that's what we had to do. After all, Venezuela received many millions of Colombians during the last 4 decades and opened their doors to us. That's what we did. Informality was very high, but I guess what you could see is that it spread. Venezuela migration into Colombia spread. It was felt obviously more and more in the big cities, but you could see Venezuelans all over Colombia. You had a good effect that was happening regarding Venezuelans moving into very small towns that had been depopulated, and that's a big opportunity for the future, because those many towns that have been depopulated because of traditional migration from small cities, opportunities, etc., to big cities. A lot of the farmhand has left, and the age of our farmers, I think it's 59. So you have a big opportunity if we do well our things. With COVID, what we have seen is that all that fell apart. Fell apart for various reasons, because we have almost 2.5 million more Colombians unemployed today than we had unemployed 2 months ago. So you're going to have competition for resources. You're going to have competition for attendance in social services. And therefore, this is a very difficult moment of Colombia, that if you look at what the international community has put per migrant is peanuts, to be very sincere. In the Syrian crisis, according to Brookings Institute, the international assistance for each migrant was around $1,500. In the Venezuelan crisis, which is almost as big as the Syrian crisis right now in terms of population, more than 5 million Venezuelans left that city, and 90% is in the region. Each refugee is getting from international aid around $150. There's a big gap in terms of needs and in terms of funding. And with the coronavirus crisis, I guess in the developed countries, I guess this is going to be more and more and more difficult. We are looking at the numbers from the international conference to see what was new money, to see what was money that was already in the pipeline, to see what was money that it was put forward in terms of aid for the next years. But the reality right now is that Eduardo Stein, a good friend of mine that I met when he was vice president, and I was vice president of Colombia, has almost an impossible job, and is to see how in the midst of a global crisis, in the midst of a global pandemic, we can create the conditions for more aid to our countries. Public sector, it's critical. And believe me, Colombia was doing exactly what was needed. We opened the doors so that any Venezuelan that came with a job offering in Colombia, anyone would get his work permits. Where did that came from? From many Colombian companies, especially in the agribusiness, said we need workers. And we opened that to Venezuelan, and the poultry industry was and here's something that we work very closely, and I guess the head of ANDI, the Colombian Association of Industrialists, and Bruce will tell you about it, was moving in the right direction. Well, the floor dropped because there's also going to be a very big competition for those jobs now. And Colombia, as you know, was a crown jewel in terms of the economic progress we had done. Colombia was moving exactly in the right direction, and that was allowing us to absorb many of the migrants that were arriving, absorb them in informality, but there was room and space. There's not so much room and space right now, and if we don't do something drastically radical, which I don't know, to be very sincere, what it is, because of the coronavirus pandemic. By the way, any Venezuelan migrant that gets the virus will be attended in Colombian hospitals just like if he was a Colombian, whether he is informal, whether he's in the formal economy, whether he's paying for his services, or whether he's not. The same we have done for children in school. So I guess Colombia has done everything right. Colombia has done what a democratic country with ties to a neighbor should do. But this problem, for the foreseeable future, can only get worse. The pandemic in South America is just increasing, it's just starting to increase. The peak for Colombia is going to be in July. The peak for Venezuela, we don't know when it's going to be because we have no numbers. But I think we will see that. I guess the monitor on that is going to be when hundreds of thousands of refugees will start coming into Colombia. You know that the criminal regime of Maduro destroyed not only the private sector, but the health sector, the education sector, everything. So unfortunately, and I wish I would have better news, but I think I would do a disservice to this panel. We're going to be in the middle of what I would call the perfect storm. Big economic crisis, COVID pandemic, huge migration from Venezuela that can only get worse, and worsening conditions in Venezuela that come with a desestabilization type of agenda that Maduro has with his allies all around the region. That's the scenario that I think we need to talk about. Yes, we're doing as much as we can. Yes, we're very grateful for all the resources we have received. It's certainly not enough and not nearly enough, but I think we have a huge global crisis in our hands that is going to create big problems for Central America, for South America, for the Caribbean, even bigger than they are now, for the US and for Canada. If the problem in Venezuela is not definitely resolved, and the only solution is real and transparent elections, which has been our policy, a new government that can reestablish control of the mafia that they have there, of everything that just imploded, we will only see this problem get worse and worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Santos, for those remarks. I will now introduce my colleague, Sarah Stamler. She is the Regional Integration Officer for the IOM team, Venezuela Response Team in Panama. So Sarah will introduce Melissa and Bruce, so I will accept their requests right now. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to the speakers and the participants for joining us today. I would also like to thank USA for IOM, Citi Foundation, and the Embassy of Colombia for organizing this relevant and timely discussion. I am honored to participate amongst our distinguished speakers and panelists. As we've just heard from Mr. Dalloglio, Mr. Stein, and Ambassador Santos, the impacts and challenges brought about from COVID-19 have been devastating, in particular for vulnerable communities, but especially for migrants and refugees from Venezuela. In the past years, there have been tremendous efforts from the government, from the private sector, from hosting communities, from the international community, civil society, NGOs, to support the social and economic integration of migrants and refugees from Venezuela. However, now with the COVID-19 pandemic, these efforts are at risk of being severely undermined. As we've heard, COVID-19 has exacerbated the already very vulnerable situation faced by Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Before the crisis, the majority have been working in the informal sector, and now with the COVID-19 pandemic, most have lost their employment and access to income. They have families to support. They are struggling to buy food, to buy medicine, to pay rent. We are seeing many who are being evicted and living in the streets. Many are begging, and many are facing increasing protection risks, such as risk to trafficking and exploitation. As we've heard just now, and as well during the pledging conference, supporting the economic recovery, as well as access to livelihoods and access to income-generating opportunities, remains a priority for all and is critical now more than ever. The private sector, such as Citi Foundation, has been precisely playing a key role in such integration efforts. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to our panelists today. We have Melissa Pino, who is the Vice President of Citi Latin America Corporate Citizenship and Government Affairs. And I'm pleased to also introduce you to Bruce McMaster, who is the President of the National Business Association of Colombia. So welcome, Melissa and Bruce. Thank you very much for joining us today. To start the conversation on the role of the private sector, so the objective of this discussion is precisely to better understand and gain insight on the important role of the private sector in supporting recovery and integration of Venezuelan refugees and migrants and their host communities. So I thought it would be great to start off with a concrete example of private sector engagement. So Melissa, could you please tell us about how Citi Foundation got involved in responding to the needs of Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and what Citi has been doing concretely? And as a follow-up, have your priorities and interventions changed with COVID-19? Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to start by saying thank you to IOM and the Embassy of Colombia for giving me the opportunity to discuss why this partnership is so important to Citi Foundation. And on a more personal level, as a first-generation Cuban American, the challenges facing the Venezuelan community are not lost on me, and I think the topic is of the utmost importance. It was mentioned by Luca and Ambassador Santos, but the outflow of Venezuelans over the last several years has led to the largest migration crisis in Latin America. Not to mention that late last year, it was set to outpace Syria, which is considered the largest migration crisis in the world. Despite all of this, response to the crisis is still considered to be largely underfunded. When we first started evaluating what role Citi Foundation could play in alleviating some of the challenges faced not only by migrants, but also their host communities, we held numerous calls and meetings with both the public and private sector to see exactly what was being addressed and what the priorities were. At the time, a lot of the focus was on immediate humanitarian assistance, which we support, but is not really one of the areas where we felt we could have the most impact. One of our largest funding initiatives is Pathways to Progress, a public funding commitment launched globally in 2016 to increase workforce development opportunities, placement, and entrepreneurship for young people. We've been a funding partner to IOM for several years, and our partnership at the time was focused on a program for at-risk youth living in areas of conflict in Colombia. So when IOM presented their migrant response plan for Latin America, particularly in the area of socioeconomic integration, we felt we found the perfect alignment. The response from IOM, both pre-COVID and now, brings in the public and private sector, which makes it easier to create scalable and holistic solutions that address extremely complex challenges. It goes without saying that this unprecedented health crisis has forced us all to think a little more deeply about our role as a partner. And like many of you at the Citi Foundation, we've made decisions to change our processes and funding strategies given the crisis. Specifically, we've redirected funding to immediate relief efforts, and we've provided existing partners and grantees with greater flexibility in terms of how they spend the grant dollars. These efforts are helping to deliver immediate relief to frontline workers and populations within the communities most impacted. They're also supporting longer-term investments in programs that focus on economic recovery and financial stability. To date, Citi and the Citi Foundation have committed more than $65 million in support of COVID-19 relief efforts at a global scale. And a key partnership for us in this journey has been our partnership with IOM. Communities who are vulnerable pre-pandemic remain at a higher risk, which makes the role of organizations like IOM fundamental. I think it's safe to say that no one actor will be able to manage through this complex health, economic, and migration crisis alone. And so partnerships with the private and philanthropic sector are going to be instrumental. That's why, from our perspective, we've made the decision to invest more deeply in IOM and their mission. Migrants are the most vulnerable groups affected by COVID-19, often lacking access to resources and proper healthcare, as you've heard. That's why, in addition to our existing partnership, Citi chose IOM as one of 4 organizations to benefit from a new employee donation campaign called Double. So for every $1 donated by a Citi employee in support of COVID-19 relief, Citi will donate $1 to IOM. To summarize, I'd say we know the work is really important. We know there's more to be done, and we're happy to partner with an organization like IOM that's significantly moving the needle for so many people.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. A very interesting example, an illustrative example of the work that Citi Foundation is doing. Thank you. Next, we would be interested in understanding the opportunities that exist to support integration for migrants and refugees from Venezuela. So Bruce, from the business association perspective, what role can migrants and refugees from Venezuela play in supporting the various industries and business sectors, and how could their integration be best supported? So for example, are there any technical skills or labor profiles or any gaps in these labor profiles and skills that Venezuelan migrants and refugees could match or fill? And what economic sectors would the profile of Venezuelans and their competencies best fit in? Over to you, Bruce.
Bruce, can you please make sure you have your mic? Yeah, and that's good. We see you, we don't hear you yet. Bruce, you were, Bruce, I think you have to request the floor again. You got out from the platform. Yes. Yes, you're in the platform now, Bruce. Can you turn on your camera and your mic? Your microphone is off. No, it's a blue, red, blue button. Yeah, right there. We can hear you
now. Well,
yes.
Well, it was turned on. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, IM. Thank you, Colombia's embassy. Well, I would like to say something before answering your question, in terms that we have all to take into account that Venezuela crisis has represented a huge challenge for Colombia since its very beginning. From the beginning, we lost a partner, we lost our main export market, we lost many of our investments in Venezuela. We gain an active actor in our internal conflict, and that has to be taken into account, and that was mentioned by the ambassador. We gain an enemy in the fight against drugs. And finally, we receive a huge volume of migrants, plenty of new needs for a country like ours that has its own huge needs. No one knows how many people we have received in Colombia. The ambassador said that it's 2 million people, maybe it's 2 million people. 2 million for Colombia is like 4% of our population. This is people that needs to be fed, people that needs a job, people that need health services, education, they need a house. And we have to say that Colombia has fostered them, every one of them. Every one of those brothers and sisters with a huge generosity. How many worlds, I would ask you, how many countries in the world which such huge needs as Colombia has would receive so many persons with such a great generosity? Sincerely, I don't really know. 2 years ago, I had an opportunity to meet the General Secretary Antonio Guterres of the UN, and told him that this was not a problem Colombia could really deal along with. This is something on which we need the private sector from the whole world, but we also need all the governments and international institutions. Now we have the COVID crisis. Our main challenge now is to take care of everyone. As you maybe know, Colombia made the decision to give health care to every person in our territory since the beginning. So we're trying to give and to attend every person that is here in Colombia. Let me now talk a little bit about the actual economic situation. At the beginning of the quarantine, only 30% of the companies were able to work. 70% were shut down. Now we are still 40% cannot operate. So this has a lot of effects on the economy. Unemployment at the beginning of the decade in Colombia was around 9%. On February this year, for many reasons, including migration, rose to 12.5%. But now with the crisis, we have some forecasts that say that this unemployment is going to be somewhere between 20 to 25%. Now it's 20 to 25%, and the economy is expected to have a negative growth of somewhere between 10 to 15% this year. This is going to be a huge social emergency for our country. And I have to say that Venezuela is not an exclusive problem of Colombia. It is a world problem and should be treated and should be solved by the whole world, including not only international organizations, other governments, but also private sector. We're trying to do our best. We're trying to make all our efforts. We're having a huge unemployment problem, and we're having a huge economy and GDP problem these years. So we have to say that we are more than happy to have them here, but we need to work together with you and together with the whole world to build solutions that really can give us the opportunity to foster them in best conditions, best possible conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. You mentioned precisely the economic difficulties that we are all facing right now. So looking into the future, and this question is for both of you, as countries do start to reopen, according to you, in what ways can the private sector best support the economic recovery of migrants and refugees from Venezuela, as well as the host communities? And what innovative solutions could we consider? So maybe could we start with you, Melissa, please? Over to you.
Sure. I think for Citi Foundation and a lot of private sector supporters, the biggest question that we ask ourselves is, how do we adapt given the current context without deviating our core initiatives? And so since the launch of Pathways to Progress, we've heavily invested in financial education and workforce development, entrepreneurship, which I think are going to be crucial in stimulating the economy once the country starts to reopen. And in addition to that, we can't forget about the entrepreneurs who were starting to launch their small business or had a small business venture pre-COVID. So to supplement that, I think we're going to focus a significant amount on growth and technical assistance for small business and entrepreneurs, and the topic of financial inclusion. For the small businesses, how do they recover from the shutdown? How do they continue to grow? How do they employ more people? Partnerships between the public and private sector are going to be crucial, like I said before, because this COVID situation is constantly evolving. We have a pretty good idea of what the ramifications will look like, but we don't know how long it's going to last, and we don't really know what the impact is going to be in the long term. To really have impactful, scalable, and sustainable impacts, we're going to have to work together. We're currently an operational partner in USAID's and the IDB's Juntos es Mejor Challenge, which is a global scale initiative to identify and fund and scale innovative solutions that address a lot of the challenges that are being faced by the Venezuelan migrant population. And so moving forward, we're going to continue to seek those innovative and collaborative solutions like the Juntos es Mejor Challenge and like the current partnership that we have with IOM.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa, for sharing the priorities from Citi. Bruce, do you have anything to add from your perspective? Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I have to tell you that we have made some studies, and we have asked Venezuelan people here in Colombia, migrants, for example, how are they being able to get a job these days? And let me tell you that these days they don't have a greater unemployment rate that we do have for Colombians today. So that means that we're giving them the same opportunities we're giving to Colombians. And that is very important, because we don't want them just to be in worse conditions than Colombians are. We cannot assure that they're gonna be in better conditions than Colombians. Here in Bogota, you would be able to find many of them being part of the supply chain that is now supporting the quarantine. That is something that is really important. And on the other hand, if you take a look at, and an ambassador mentioned this in its intervention, on the countryside, they have been working on the agribusiness. And agribusiness, let me tell you, that agribusiness is the only sector that has really grown during this crisis. While, for example, building and housing decreased or had a negative growth of 9%, agribusiness had a positive growth of 6%. And this is specific in field. We are able to find a lot of migrants. So that is definitely an opportunity for them. But let me just be very sincere with you. The problem is so huge in terms of unemployment here in Colombia that I have to tell you, or I have to say, I'm being honest in telling everyone that our goal now is that they don't have a greater problem than the Colombians are having here in the country, but because we're trying to give solutions to everyone that needs a solution and solution today. But when you have 20%, you have a huge problem, or 25% unemployment, you have a huge problem. Then we will have the future in terms of how do we take care of them, how we give them opportunities, how we give them education, how we give them health care, and that so we're having at the same time a lot of challenges that we have to face. And as was mentioned, this is a multi-dimensional problem that has to be solved by everyone, and we hope to have international cooperation on this.
Great, thank you very much, Bruce. We would like to open up the floor for Q&A. So thank you, Melissa and Bruce, for sharing your valuable insights and experiences. I would like to invite the audience, if you have any questions for Bruce or Melissa. We are also inviting back Mr. Stein and Ambassador Santos. If you have any questions for them, please include them in the chat box and we will read them out. I would also like to inform you that we will also be addressing some questions that came during the registration. And I would also like to inform you that Ambassador Santos has to leave us at 11 a.m. So we will try to prioritize questions for him as well. But we are also very happy to let you know that we have a special guest joining us. We have Felipe Munoz, who is the presidential advisor for the Venezuela border of the Colombian government. So welcome, Felipe. We're very happy that you are able to join us today. In case you have questions for Ambassador Santos and he has left, Felipe can also answer those questions. So before we get into the Q&A, I would like to give the floor to Felipe for some remarks. I also just wanted to mention, Ambassador Santos already mentioned a few aspects of how Colombia is working to integrate Venezuelan refugees and migrants, but this is one of the questions we received during registration. So if you could if you wanted to add anything or elaborate any aspect on how Colombia is integrating Venezuelan migrants and refugees, please, we would welcome that. Thank you very much, and over to you, Felipe.
No, thank you for inviting me, and a special thank you to USA for IOM and Ana Duran and all the Colombia's team have been a very, very good partner for us in all this process, and say thank you to the Citibank as well, because it was one of the first private companies that jumped in it just to try to helping us in this process of migration. Say hello to Bruce, to Mr. Stein, and to our Ambassador Santos. Just three main ideas about how the private sector could be a very good partner. We had been working with a key stakeholder, the Private Business Association, the Chamber of Commerce, the key leader business, and we see this as these actors as an allies with us in trying to transform the common view that you have the private sector just with grants, with refugees, and we need to create another opportunities. And this is the reason that we think that the private sector is part of the solution for the migrant and refugee situation. We know that some of the barriers that for business engagement are created by limitation to our policies and institutions, and this is the reason that we create an economic inclusion policy with 10 points that we are follow, try to take off all the legal barriers just to promote, because they need to be a win-win strategy. The second one is that we create a private sector platform just to raise the awareness and try to mobilize resources. We need to commit the private sector in common agendas as labor market inclusion, impact investment, sectoral plans, and we are preparing for the second semester of 2020 to strengthen this private sector platform. But also because we see opportunities and challenges in the private sector involvement, we need to sharing capabilities such as technology and technical expertise, but as Bruce had mentioned, we need to integrate it into value chains by hiring migrants directly or indirectly, working with small entrepreneurs that hire migrants through sourcing of subcontracting work. And we need to extend the service by adapting the current business model to assess good services. And we begin to working with that. This is not a new task. We are working with the private sector, but also we know that we need to understand better. We need to have a better data. When I have so many conversations with Bruce, some of the companies say we need to understand where are the vacancies, what are the sectors that need maybe to take advantage of the skills that the migrants have. Then We need to create a better set of information and develop in industry level strategies to include migrants into supply chains. For example, in flowers, in the agricultural sector, in retail, in coffee, in construction, and even in hospitality in the post-COVID scenario. And also, we have two main financial tools that maybe it could be useful for the private sector. One is to need to advance in innovative finance. We have some very good examples before, for example, the social impact bonds. We have some very good examples in that. And this is one of the reasons that I am working very closely with Open Society Foundation and Fundación Mario Santo Domingo, two very good partners that are helping us in strengthening our position with the private sector. And just to finalize, we create a tax incentive. This is a special tax regime that if you invest in the border sectors that are the sectors that are geographically heavily affected by the migration, you obtain a tax income zero for 5 years and 50% of the rate for the next 5 years. We create this with the support of the Congress and in conjunction with the private sector and with rules or all the people in the private sector, because there needs to be not only the private sector as a provider of grants, as a provider of humanitarian aid. We need to see this as the private sector as a key stakeholder, as we have seen in other parts of the world in this process to create better conditions for the almost 2 million migrants that Colombia generously had accepted. And we need to continue because the situation in Venezuela is worsened day by day. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Felipe. These were some very interesting and relevant points. So thank you for sharing these. We have two questions for you, Mr. Stein. I will read both of them. The first question is, how and where can the private sector philanthropy make a real difference? And the second question that we received is, how can we work with Plan Team to innovate large-scale private finance using regional and global capital markets to equal pledging conference amounts?
Could you kindly repeat the second one? I didn't quite get it, please.
Yes, let me try to see. Basically, how can we work to innovate large-scale private finance using the regional and global capital markets to equal the amounts from the pledging conference? Does that make a bit more sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you again. Bye-bye to Ambassador Santos. I wanted to tie him to the chair so that he wouldn't leave the conversation, but we're very happy to welcome Felipe Munoz. To the first question, I think that private sector philanthropy is already playing a very important role in several aspects, and yet it depends on the conditions of every country in which they're working and how sub-regional and international laws have been evolving recently. We don't really know how we are going to relate internationally in many aspects after this pandemic is over, but I would say that an important role like the one Citi and Citi Foundation are playing in our response is a good example. We received a millionaire contribution, 1 million. It can go a very long way to help recover and assist migrants and refugees integrate in the societies that receive them. Clearly, it's helping to have these awareness and educational platforms like the one we're having today. But in practice, we have already experienced in some of the countries, as Felipe was illustrating, very concrete ways in which, if we have the proper information, the skills and capacities of Venezuelan migrants can be integrated almost immediately into some specialized activities. Maybe the case of Peru with Venezuelan medical doctors is a case in point, or the case of Argentina with oil engineers. But what about the large masses of people, most of them destitute, that have been going out of Venezuela for maybe a year and a half or 2 years recently, which do not have highly specialized skills or capacities? That is where innovation that is constantly brewed within the activities of private sector companies can really bloom in the region. And taking advantage that Felipe Munoz is here, his post maybe betrays the transcendental type of vision and efforts that are needed to deal with borderline economic activities, some of which were traditionally very, very blossoming and productive between Colombia and Venezuela. But that physical border is larger than 2,200 kilometers. It's almost the distance between Madrid and Berlin. And yet, sometimes in some border areas, those commercial activities, economic activities, are always looked with suspicion, as if contraband was the main activity. And it is not true. I think that the private sector can really help in trying to innovate, but also to facilitate taking root of economic activities in borderline areas. The second question, I am afraid I am not very competent to answer, because it falls in an area of international finance that I am not really very competent at. But the fact that a lot of European investors, as well as Canadian and United States investors, have been looking at Latin American options in recent years is a good indication of the rapid evolution that favors foreign investment in many sectors of the economy, and for the recovery efforts that are going to be needed, some of which are already underway after we go over this pandemic. Many sectors are already open for it. Again, a mistreatment of those issues in terms of poisonous political interpretations have to be done away with and get concrete, verifiable, and trustworthy information in energy, in infrastructure, and in productive activities, mostly related to food and food security, which are going to be needed very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stein. We've received another question. I will read this. It is for all. We are seeing how the COVID crisis is particularly affecting women and children, with women disproportionately losing livelihoods, increasingly at risk of gender-based violence, and children out of school and missing vaccinations, for example. These challenges for all women and children come on top of the heightened risks faced by refugee women and children. How are IOM and the private sector working to address these particular challenges for Venezuelan women and children? So maybe on the IOM side, I can respond quickly, and then perhaps we could hear from the private sector side. So maybe if Melissa and Bruce would like to then follow up. So before the crisis, we've already seen many challenges and obstacles and vulnerabilities, differences between men and women. We have data that shows that women were particularly were more unemployed, or there were higher levels of unemployment and underemployment from women. In addition, in a lot of cases, we've seen that women, in some cases, have higher levels of education than men. However, due to the context, they're oftentimes employed in jobs that do not match their skill level. They face various challenges, one of them being the fact that they have children to care for. They oftentimes do not have access to centers that care for children or family members that can care for them, so making it more difficult for them to seek employment. We also see discrimination against women based on their migratory status and on their gender. We also see challenges linked with sexual harassment in the workplace, as well as gender-based violence. Now with the coronavirus pandemic, we're seeing these vulnerabilities and challenges exacerbated. One alarming statistic is that gender-based violence has increased by 173% in the Latin America and Caribbean region. So what is IOM doing? IOM has a three-pronged approach. The first one is IOM mitigates risks for gender-based violence. It does so by identifying these risks, for example, through the DTM. And once these risks have been identified, IOM integrates these into its programming, especially in its shelter response and NFI distributions. The second approach is supporting GBV survivors, particularly by facilitating access to adequate health care as well as case management. And finally, IOM addresses the root causes of GBV. This can be done through policies, through different SOPs, but also through empowerment of women. So this could maybe be an interesting aspect of private sector partnership in livelihoods and empowerment of women. And just to also mention that IOM does co-lead the GBV subsector in the platform, and they are currently working in the COVID context on hotlines, remote support for GBV survivors, capacity building, and key messaging. So that is, in a nutshell, the IOM response. Melissa, would you, from the private sector perspective, do you have any thoughts? Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Similar to what you just said, Sarah, I think COVID has severely exacerbated a lot of the challenges that women faced before the pandemic. Typically, we take the role of caretaker, which makes it difficult for us to leave the household, leave children, especially in the situation of female migrants who may not have a family support system that other women do. It makes it difficult for us to take advantage of the opportunities presented by, different programs put on by NGOs or supported by the private sector. And so what we've done on the Citi Foundation side is when we look at entrepreneurship and when we look at employment, try to focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized groups like migrants, like women, to make sure that we're giving them the support that we need to take those opportunities, and also level the playing field in certain sectors like cybersecurity, like coding, where women typically don't see the opportunity to participate or learn about those careers. The other thing that we've looked at is connectivity and digitizing a lot of the content that is shared by our partners, particularly because of the reason that we typically take the role of caretaker and we can't leave the homes and home. So how do we bring those opportunities to the women, as opposed to, you know, sort of ignoring the challenges that they face, even if they do want to go out and do something different, and advance their families' economic stability, etc.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. I have a question here. This one will be for Felipe. What strategies are in place to prevent COVID in cities amongst migrants? So perhaps if you could just let us know what the government has been doing in Colombia to prevent COVID amongst the migrant population. Thank you.
First of all, we have been in the last 3 years in a process of regularization. We have been regularized more than 700,000 migrants. This is not comparable in any other country in the world, as Bruce said before. This is the reason that we have these people ready to work. Of course, this is not the same that they can get a work, but they have the permit from the government to work in any sector. Then this is the reason that we have to work harder with the private sector just to try to get these people into the formal market. But secondly, we create a 6-point plan just to prevent, just to include the migrants into the process. We don't have any separation here. The hell of one is the hell of everyone. Then we decided just to strengthen the capacity for the health system, and we attend any migrant as COVID, as far as COVID is concerned, as the same as any other Colombian. But of course, we have a special points for cities, 2 on the border with Venezuela, Villa del Rosario in Norte de Santander, and Maicao in La Guajira, and also Soacha, which is a locality near to Bogota, and also Ipiales at the south of the border, because some migrants are returning from Peru to Ecuador and trying to cross to Colombia just to return to Venezuela. Then we have a 6-point plan just to include the migrants in all the response, to include them in the social programs, and to work very hard, especially with IOM, in transform the programs that we had before in cash transfers. Because the major need that we have now is that the people can pay their rents. And in this way, we can prevent from eviction from their homes. And this is the reason that we are. But we include the migrants in our public response, but we are working this very closely with International Cooperation Agency and with the NGOs.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Felipe. I see that we are almost at the closing, so I will ask one more question. I just would like to let the audience know that for all the remaining questions that we were not able to answer, we will leave our contact information at the end so that you can send us your questions, and then we will get back to you with a response after the event. So the last question is for Bruce, Melissa, and Mr. Stein. When the private sector chooses to invest in humanitarian projects, the components of responsibility, philanthropy, and business intersect. Where do you see shared values and mutual benefits in this intersection? Maybe we can start with you, Bruce. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I would like to say that shared value is one of the main pillars we have put into the place for philanthropy work and social responsibility work for Andy. To the extent that we brought here Michael Porter and Kramer, and we are trying to really be able to tell every company that this is the best way of doing things. This is not only applicable to what we're saying regarding migrants, but also in every activity we're doing here in Colombia. So this is very important. This is something we're doing. I would like just to give to leave a final message on this and tell that when you talk about private sector, you talk about private sector present in Colombia.
I would like to really make a call to the private sector that is not present in Colombia for doing business to be part of the solution in terms of migrants. That is something that is really important. Citi, for example, is here in Colombia and they're doing things, but a lot of huge companies that are not present in Colombia, they do have an opportunity to really support what we're doing in this country that needs really the support of the whole world just to give solutions to this huge situation we're having with migrants. Yeah, and now for more than 5 years. So this is something on which we need a lot of work and a lot of resources coming from everywhere in the world.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Over to you, Melissa.
I'll be very brief. One of the things, or the values we live by at Citi is that we strive every day to make a positive impact in the communities where we live and work. And those are the things, the challenges faced by those communities. And so that's why we choose to invest in the program that we do. That lied a little.
Sorry, my computer is freezing.
Yeah, I think it's Melissa's computer. Melissa, if you can repeat the answer, we got cut off. Sorry.
Yeah, my computer is lagging a little too. I'll be brief. One of the values that we live by at Citi is we strive to make an impact in the communities where we live and work. And our that is addressing challenges that our community face. And so that we choose to invest in programs like the one that I has to support the Venezuelan migrants.
Great, thank you, Melissa. And over to you, Mr. Stein.
Well, I would like to thank again the invitation for this timely conversation and maybe underscore two things. One is that this effort at shared values and experiences have been in effect, fortunately, through a voluntary action from the various receiving countries in Latin America. Their governments wanted to separate the political tables at which discussions of high-level problems in the region could be taking place from what were specifically technical shared preoccupations, like documentation of Venezuelan refugees and migrants. And in this regard, the experience of the larger private companies that are already present in Latin America, as well as local large companies within the different countries, have been nearing the concept of shared responsibility. Something that from the outset, all of the countries were convinced that each and every one could not deal with independently, with the complexity, the size, and the reach and the depth of these migration crises, which is doubly complicated by the pandemic. So in this regard, the experience of the private sector in transnational operations is extremely valuable as shared experiences, but also as joint responsibility. And the second underscoring element I would like to end at least my participation with is the fact that there seems to be a group of prejudices that whenever we talk about private sector, a lot of people, mostly in the cities, think of very large companies, the very big ones. When the fact in our economic development and evolvement is that there are tens of thousands of small and micro enterprises that also need to tap on the experience of larger companies that could as well become part of this co-responsibility, in which, as I said before, this experience with Citi is proven to be very, very fruitful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stein. We are coming to a close of the event, so I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Stein, Ambassador Santos, Bruce, Melissa, and Felipe for joining us today. We really appreciate your sharing of your perspectives, your insights, and your experiences. These have been extremely interesting for us. There are various points that were raised that will be central in strengthening our partnership with the private sector as we work together to address the pressing needs of migrants and refugees from Venezuela and their host communities in these difficult times. So thank you very much again, and I give the floor to Maria for closing.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers. We have really enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you for the audience. I do want to close by providing this slide where you can see the funding requirements as of May 26th. This is before the conference. The number has increased, the funding has increased significantly since that day. However, it's not reflected in this slide, given that those pledges done on the donor conference on Tuesday have not been, we have not received the details yet, and how and to what sectors would those go. So I know that there was a question about the percentages of and how much will go to integration, for example, and I think this slide captures a lot of the information by sector. So from the 1.4 billion as of May 26, we had received 167 million. I know, and again, I repeat, this is information before the donor pledging conference, and the numbers are being updated. You can access this information in the platform website, the Venezuela Response Platform website, r4v.info. And you can also see how the sectors and the people in need, the people targeted, and the requirements are by sector. So with this information, I would just like to encourage those that we couldn't answer your questions to please send us an email to our info email or my email. I put it in the chat. We are going to have future topics and calls around COVID-19. We are going to have one soon on big data and mapping mobility for the COVID-19 response, and we're going to feature our DTM platform, our DTM displacement tracking metrics. We are also going to have another one on analyses, the challenge of analysis in real time. We're going to look at challenges in responding to COVID-19 in camp settings, and we're going to have examples like Bangladesh. So there are a lot of calls and briefing calls that we are going to be conducting in the next couple of weeks and months, and we are surely going to invite you to join those. So again, our social media, and thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, the speakers, and have a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.